Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Terumos, Chapter 1, Halacha 1. This is part 7 of this year. This is going to be in the Art Scroll, page 7A1. Today, we are getting into the concept of hearing brachas. We are dealing with the concept of a deaf person who can't hear. What happens when they're going to say a bracha? What's going to happen if they're going to read the Megillah? What's going to happen if they say the Shema? Did they dispatch the obligation? Well, we learned about this in Masechet Brachos. In Masechet Brachos, it says that you have to say it, but also it should be low enough for you to hear it. In other words, it's not just whispering it or reading it silently. You're supposed to hear it yourself. And this corresponds back to hearing Hashem's command when the commandments are given over on Har Sinai. So the Mishnah starts off, it says that we learned in a Mishnah elsewhere. The Gemara starts off talking about a Mishnah that we learned elsewhere in Tractate Megillah, and it says that all are qualified to read the Megillah except for the deaf person, a deranged person, and a minor. Now, why do we care about this? Well, over there, can you dispatch the obligation on the Megillah if somebody can't hear it but they're reading it? Well, over here, can you dispatch the obligation on Terumos if you can't hear what you're saying? That's why this is related to this. So Rav Masna in this Gemara says that the Mishnah of disqualification for a deaf person for the Megillah reading is reflective of the opinion of Rabbi Yosei. And Rabbi Yosei, by the way, over there is talking about saying the Shema, and Rabbi Yosei is going to be saying that the Shema has to also be audible within the person's ear. And so because a Megillah reading of a deaf person, according to Rabbi Yosei, he also can't hear it, just like he's required to hear the Shema when he says it himself, he's also required to hear the Megillah reading, and it has to be audible within his own ear. So there's another Amora who comments on Rabbi Masna's assertion, and this is going to be Rabbi Yossi the Amora. Before, we were just talking about Rabbi Yossi the Tana. So Rabbi Yossi the Amora says that we originally thought to say that in regards to what case do the rabbis and Rabbi Yossi disagree. In other words, where does Rabbi Yossi maintain that the recital that is inaudible to a person's ear is going to be invalid only regarding the Shema? Now, why? The Gemara says, regarding the Shema, it is written, "Hear, O Israel." So, Rabbi Yosei, the logic that Rabbi Yosei is going with is that it also has to be heard while you're hearing it. The Gemara continues and says, but in regard to the other mitzvahs where the Torah does not state "hear," they do not disagree. In other words, Rabbi Yosei is conceding that a recital that is inaudible to a person's ear is going to be valid. So from here we see that Rav Masna said that the Mishnah which disqualifies a deaf person for the Megillah reading is reflective of the opinion of Rabbi Yosei. Now, Rabbi Yosei holds that since the person can't hear his own reading, it's not valid. So this is telling us that the recital of the Shema is going to be the same as the other mitzvahs in the Torah. In other words, Rabbi Yossi is holding that regarding all mitzvahs that require speech, that the performance of a deaf person is not valid even after the fact because a person can't hear his own recital. Now, we see over here from a commentary of the Haredim the Haredim was a great Yerushalmi commentator, but we're limited to only a couple of Masechtot. Brachas is one of them, and we're dealing with his commentary now on the Shema. He's saying that that according to Rabbi Yossi, wherever the Torah requires a recital, like Birkat Hamazon, it is not valid if the person does not make it audible in his own ears. And again, why does that pertain to Terumos? Well, there's a Terumos declaration. The person has to separate Terumos and declare it. So let's get back to the word Shema, which is to hear. And the Gemara is going to explore Rabbi Yossi's basis for extending the stipulation of audibility to other contexts. In other words, Rabbi Yossi is basically saying that when the Torah says Shema, it's talking about a hekesh for other spoken brachas that also should be heard by the person as well. So that's how he's going to disqualify a deaf person from doing this. So the Gemara says, what is the basis for the opinion of Rabbi Yossi that audibility is critical throughout the Torah? And it says, it's the verse where it says, and you shall hearken to his mitzvahs. In other words, this is going to be Exodus 15:26, and Rabbi Yossi is going to understand that regarding all mitzvahs regarding speech, it says, let your ears hear what your mouth expresses. So, according to this conclusion, Rabbi Yossi is holding that even the blessing over the separation of the truma is invalid if a deaf person does that. So, Rav Masna was stating that in the Mishnah and Masechet Megillah, that it's going to disqualify a deaf person from reading the Megillah. That's Rabbi Yossi's opinion. Now, the Gemara is going to give a different look at how this Mishnah is worded. Rav Chisda says that in a correct reading of the Mishnah, a deaf person is not included here among those who are disqualified from reading the Megillah, and it is due to the flow of speech that some students erroneously inserted that the term in the Mishnah. In other words, the Mishnah does not discuss a deaf person, and it has no bearing on the dispute between Rabbi Yossi and the sages regarding one who does not hear words. Now, since throughout the Talmud, a deaf person, like a deaf mute, is commonly listed together with a deranged person, also a minor, students of the Mishnah made a mistake and inserted the words Herish here as well. In other words, that they put deaf here. So Rav Chisda is making the radical statement that the word Herish was inserted in the Mishnah accidentally or erroneously, and it's stemming from the following consideration: that as a rule, when this term appears in the Mishnah together with a deranged person or a minor, it also has a deaf mute. And so this Mishnah has two of those things, says Rav Chisda, and then students later added this third one, the deaf mute, in there as well. Now, in light of Rav Chisda's explanation of the Mishnah and the Megillah, the Gemara is going to discuss how Rav Chisda is approaching this Mishnah. It's a very radical idea here. So Rabbi Yossi the Amara says that it is reasonable to say that Rav Chisda will concede regarding our Mishnah in Terumos that it's reflective of the Tana Rabbi Yossi's opinion. In other words, Rav Chisda is agreeing that the dispute between Rabbi Yossi and the Tanna Kama in Brachos, that's also stated in the context of the Shema, is going to have other implications as well. And in our Mishnah, which is going to forbid a deaf person from separating out Truma, that's going to be the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. So the Amara Rabbi Yossi is basically saying that the Tana Rabbi Yossi is going to invalidate inaudible recitals in any context. So that is going to, we're going to look at that opinion a little bit more. So the Gemara says that, now it's another Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Bon, who by the way is an Amara as well, said that you are compelled to say that from our Mishnah, this one here in Terumos 1:1, that it's reflective of the opinion of Rabbi Yossi's opinion, Rabbi Yossi the Tana. And nobody can dispute that. Now, before, says this Gemara, stating the law regarding a deaf person who can speak, the Mishnah teaches the initial list of 5 people who may not separate out Truma, and it does not include a deaf person who can speak among them. So why is he not included in that list? So if you will say that it is because the Mishnah concludes that with regard to those 5, their Truma is not valid Truma even after the fact, whereas the Truma separation of the deaf person who can speak might be valid after the fact. So somebody could come and argue and say, says this Gemara, that in this chapter, the Mishnah teaches a list of 5 other people who may not separate out Truma, but whose Truma separation is valid after the fact. and nonetheless it does not include a deaf person who can speak among them. Rather, what it's doing is it's singling out the case of a deaf person who can speak, and it teaches this law by itself. And why? Because perhaps it might be valid after the fact, but in the case of a person who can neither hear nor speak, even after the fact, it's not valid. So in other words, this person who's just deaf is going to be in a different class by himself, and that is why it is going to be not reflective in the list. In other words, we have two kinds of deaf people here. We have the deaf mute who can neither hear nor speak, and we have the deaf person who can speak, but he cannot hear. And so, according to what Rabbi Yossi the Tana would be saying, he's saying, look, you can't separate out Truma because he has to be able to hear the recital, but if he did do it, perhaps it is valid after the fact. But everybody would agree that the deaf mute who did it did not couldn't speak it and couldn't hear it, and a separation like this would never be valid after the fact. So the Gemara says that you will ultimately say that the law of the deaf person was taught separately because this section of the Mishnah reflects only Rabbi Yossi's opinion, whereas the remaining laws that are taught are unanimous. In other words, everybody agrees. And so when Rebbe, says the Korban Ada, arranged the Mishnah, he kept the case of the deaf person who can speak separate from the other five whose Truma separation is valid after the fact, because in regard to these five, the teaching is unanimous, but in regards to the deaf person, it's just Rabbi Yossi. So that's another way to look at it. So the Mishnah stated that the deaf person, this is going to be the Harish, of whom the sages are talking about in all these places, by the way, can neither hear nor speak. So normally when the Mishnah speaks of the Harish, the deaf mute, it's somebody who could not speak, not hear. And this is a little bit nuanced now because we're talking about a case where this person can hear, but he can't, or he can speak, he just can't hear. So we learned in a Mishnah elsewhere in Chagiga, it's actually going to be the start of Chagiga, talking about the mitzvah to appear at the temple during the 3 holidays of the foot. And the Gemara says that all are obligated in the mitzvah of Re'iyah except a deaf person, that's going to be the Cherish, a deranged person, and a minor. Sorry, that Gemara is referring to the Mishnah in the start of Chagiga. And the Gemara is understanding that in this Mishnah, the term Cherish does not refer strictly to a deaf mute. It's just including both somebody who is a deaf person who can speak and a mute who can hear. And the Gemara is going to look for a scriptural source to rule that these individuals are going to be exempt from the holidays of the foot, the Re'iyah. So the Gemara says the members of the academy said in the name of Rabbi Lazar that it is written regarding the mitzvah of gathering in the temple Heichel every 7 years on Sukkos, and it says, gather together the people so that they will hear and so that they will learn. This is in Devarim 31:12. This verse is implying that only people who can hear are included in that mitzvah. So this verse is not needed to exempt the deaf mute from Heichel. So why would that be? Because he's exempt from all mitzvahs due to his mental incompetence. Rather, this specific verse is dealing with somebody who can speak but can't hear. And this person is mentally competent, but he's excluded from the Heichel obligation because of this verse. In other words, the verse is worded this way not to exclude the deaf mute, they're already excluded, but it's to exclude the deaf person who can speak. Now, the Gemara says that so far we know to exclude only one who speaks but does not hear, and that's based on the phrase so that they will hear. And how do we know that it's going to also exclude one who hears but can't speak from the mitzvah of the Chayfel? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Hillel says in the name of Rabbi Lazar, read the verse so that they will learn, as it says, so they will teach. So since someone who cannot speak can't teach others, he's exempt from the mitzvah of Chaychel, even if he can hear. And if we know that the deaf mute who can speak and a mute who can hear are exempt from the mitzvah of cheichel, we can also conclude that they're also exempt from the mitzvah of re'iyah, since there's a gezerah shava that links these two mitzvahs. And then when the Mishnah exempts a cheresh, who's going to be the deaf mute, from the mitzvah of re'iyah, then it does not refer only to the deaf mute, but also to the deaf person who can speak, and, by the way, a mute person who can hear. So, again, it's splitting it up to say that you're gonna have to have two of these senses. You're gonna have to be able to speak and hear, and at the same time. And if you don't have the ability to speak but you can hear, or you have the ability to hear but not speak, you're excluded. Why? Because it's to learn and to teach. You have to be able to do both. So, based on this observation, the Gemara is going to comment. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yonah said that this, in effect, says that Rebbe's general rule that he sets down in the Mishnah are not absolute rules. In other words, we learned in a Mishnah that, and by the way, we find, as a general rule stated in the Mishnah, that we can't assume it's an absolute rule because the Mishnah sometimes teaches rules without listing their exceptions. So, we learned in a Mishnah that a deaf person who can speak but cannot hear may not separate out truma initially, but if he did separate out truma, his truma is valid truma. And the deaf person of whom the sages speak of in all the places and whose truma separation is invalid, even after the fact, is the one who can neither hear nor speak. But regarding the mitzvah of re'iyah, we believe that's correct to say, says this Gemara, and indeed we're demonstrating that one who hears but does not speak is included in the term perish, and that one who speaks but does not hear is also included in the term herish. In other words, both of them are encompassed by the Mishnah's exclusion of the herish from the mitzvah of the re'iyah over in Chagiga, and we see in our Mishnah's general rule regarding the definition of a herish that it is not absolutely not absolute. So, in other words, that when we're talking about the herish, we're talking about somebody who has limited capability, and that they're not just a deaf mute. There's somebody who also can, maybe has one of the facilities missing and not the other. The Gemara is going to confirm this observation, and the Gemara says we learned in the Mishnah. This is going to be in Yevamos 12:4. That if a deaf man, and again the Mishnah uses the word cherish here, performed chalitza, or if a deaf woman who's a hareshet performed chalitza, or if a woman performed chalitza to a minor, her chalitza is invalid. And Rabbi Yochanan said that the reason that a chalitza involving a deaf man or woman is invalid is because they cannot enunciate the scriptural recitals that are part of the chalitza recital or ritual. And, where it says, and he shall say, and she shall say, and it says, what the Gemara is. The Gemara is referring to Devarim 25, and the verses prescribing what the Yevam and the Yevamah has to say. So how can they say it, since the chalitza of a deaf person is invalid because he can't speak? So then the cherish over here in the Mishnah is referring to anyone who can't speak, even if they can hear. And the Gemara says we learned in the Mishnah that the cherish of whom the sages spoke of in all places is the one who can neither hear nor speak. This, by the way, is going to support, says the Gemara, Rabbi Yonah. Rabbi Yonah says, with respect to the Mishnah and the mitzvah of re'iyah, this says in effect that Rebbe's general rule, which he set down in the Mishnahs, are not absolute rules, and the Mishnah regarding a chalitza provides additional proof of this observation. And so the Shenis Eliyahu is noting that even Rabbi Yonah's proof is going to be valid only according to a simple reading of the Mishnah. And so, the Mishnah in Chagiga that Rabbi Yonah himself is citing demonstrates that, our Mishnah's rule is not absolute. And, where it says, the Mishnah is exempting a cherish, a deranged person, and a minor from re'iyah, the cherish can include the deaf person who can speak and the mute who can hear. And so the Herish is really just kind of used more euphemistically as a catch-all, that somebody who's limited in one way, not necessarily both ways. Have a great day.